I'm 88 years old, and I need to tell you something that I have never told anyone, not my closest friend, not my pastor, not the neighbor who brings me soup when I'm sick and has known me for 30 years, because some truths are too quiet to say out loud, too private to share at dinner, too painful to put into words when someone is looking at you. But I'm going to say it today, right now, to you. Because if you have a child who has gone silent, if you know what it feels like to watch your phone and wonder why it doesn't ring, you need to hear what happened to me. And if you have a child who is present and attentive and calls every Sunday without fail, you need to hear this even more. My son didn't speak to me for 3 years. 3 years of birthdays that passed without a call. 3 years of holidays I spent with the space where he used to be. 3 years of telling myself it was temporary, that something had happened, that he was busy, that he would come back when things settled down. And then one day, he did come back. And I wish he hadn't. Not because I don't love him. I love my son the way only a mother can, without logic, without condition, without end. I loved him through the silence. I loved him through the confusion. I loved him through every night I sat in my kitchen and wondered what I had done wrong. But what I heard when he finally called taught me something about love that no one had ever told me, something that changed the way I see every relationship in my life, something I am going to tell you right now. If this is something you needed to hear today, consider subscribing. I share stories like this every week. Stories about family, about aging, about the things nobody says out loud but everyone needs to hear. The button is right below. It costs nothing. And it might mean more than you expect. Let me take you back to where this began. My son's name is Daniel. He was not always distant. For most of his life, he was the child I worried about least. Not because I loved him less, but because he seemed to have found his footing in the world earlier than the others. Steady job, good marriage, 2 children I adore, a life that looked from the outside like it had come together the way lives are supposed to. We were close in the way that mothers and sons can be close without either of them fully acknowledging it. We didn't talk every day, but we talked regularly, comfortably, the way people talk when they don't need to perform for each other. And then, about 4 years ago, something shifted. I couldn't tell you exactly when it started. That's the thing about distance. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a confrontation or a slammed door or an argument you can point to and say, that is where it broke. It arrives quietly. A call that doesn't come. A holiday that gets canceled. A birthday acknowledged with a text instead of a voice. Small things. The kind of things you can explain away one at a time, and I explain them away, because that is what mothers do. He's busy, he has his own life, he has pressures I don't fully understand. This is what it looks like when children become adults, and the relationship changes shape. I told myself all of it. I believed most of it. And then a year passed, and then another. And the explanation started to feel less like comfort and more like a story I was telling myself to avoid a harder truth. The harder truth was this: my son had chosen, for reasons I did not know, to disappear from my life. I want to tell you what those 3 years felt like, not to make you feel sorry for me. I am not asking for that, but because I think some of you know exactly what I'm describing, and I think the people who know it are often the people who are least willing to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud means admitting that your child, the person you carried and raised and stayed up worrying about and rearranged your life for, chose not to be present. And that is a particular kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. It is not grief exactly, because the person is still alive, still out there in the world, living their life, presumably fine. It is not anger exactly, because anger requires a target, and the target keeps changing every time you reach for it. It is something quieter than both of those things, something that sits in the ordinary moments of your day and makes them strange. Setting the table for one and noticing the chairs that are empty, seeing something funny and reaching for your phone to share it and then remembering, hearing a song that means something to both of you and having nowhere to put that meaning. The absence becomes a presence, a shape in the room that you learn to move around. I learned to move around it, move. I kept my routines, I kept my friendships, I kept the garden and the Tuesday lunches with my friend Patricia and the book I was always in the middle of. I kept showing up for my life, but I kept showing up with something missing, and I knew it, even when I didn't say it. The call came on a Thursday morning in October. I remember because I had just come in from the garden. My hands were still dirty. The phone was on the kitchen table and I almost didn't look at it. And then I did. His name on the screen. I stood there for a moment before I answered. Not because I didn't want to pick up, because something in me, some quiet instinct I hadn't known I had, hesitated. I picked up. His voice was warm, familiar, the voice I had known for 60 years, since he was small enough to fit in my arms, and for a moment, just a moment, everything dissolved. The 3 years, the silence, the space at the table, all of it. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He said he'd been thinking about me. I said I was glad, and we talked, for almost an hour, about his children, my grandchildren, whom I had seen only in photographs for years, about his work, about the house they were thinking of renovating, about ordinary things that felt extraordinary simply because I was hearing his voice say them. I didn't ask about the silence. I didn't mention the 3 years, because I was so relieved to have him back that I didn't want to do anything that might make him leave again. That was my first mistake. He called again the following week and the week after that, and each time I felt the relief a little more and the hesitation a little less. I told myself that whatever had happened had passed, that he had come back, that this was enough. My friend Patricia asked me once, during this period, how I was feeling about it all. I told her I was happy, that Daniel was back in my life, and that was what mattered. She looked at me for a moment the way Patricia sometimes does, the way of someone who has known you long enough to see past what you're saying. She didn't push, but I thought about her look for a long time afterward. The third call was different, still warm on the surface, still his voice, still the familiar rhythms of how we had always talked. But this time, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he said something that changed the temperature of the room. He mentioned casually that he and his wife had been thinking about the future, their future, the uncertainty of things, how difficult it had become for people their age to build security. And then he mentioned, just in passing, just as something he'd been wondering about, whether I had given any thought to my arrangements, my will, the house, what I intended to do with things eventually. He said it gently, with care, as if it were simply a practical question that responsible families discussed. And I sat very still, because something that had been living in the back of my mind for weeks, something I had been refusing to look at directly, stepped into the light. I thought about the timing, 3 years of silence, and then warmth, attention, interest, weekly calls, and now this question. I didn't say any of this out loud. I answered vaguely. I said I had things in order and that I'd thought about it. I changed the subject. We said goodbye warmly, and then I sat in my kitchen for a very long time. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story that is easiest to tell wrong. It would be simple to make Daniel the villain of this story, to say that his return was calculated from the beginning, that the warmth was false, that the calls were a performance. I don't know if that's true. I genuinely don't know. What I know is what happened. The sequence of events, the timing, the question that arrived after weeks of rebuilding. And I know what it felt like to sit in that kitchen and hold all of it at once. It felt like grief, Not the grief of losing someone, the grief of seeing something clearly that you had been hoping was different. Because here is the thing about absence and return. When someone disappears from your life for 3 years and then comes back, you want to believe that the return is about love, about regret, about missing you, and maybe it was, partly. I don't know Daniel's interior. I cannot tell you what was in his heart when he dialed my number that Thursday morning, but I know what came next, and what came next told me something. I called my attorney the following Monday, not to punish Daniel, not to disinherit him, not out of anger, out of clarity. I wanted to understand what I had, what it meant, what my options were. I wanted to have that conversation from a position of knowledge rather than from the fog of confusion and relief and grief that had been my state for the past several weeks. My attorney is a woman about 15 years younger than me, practical, direct, without sentiment. I appreciate all 3 of those qualities. I told her the situation. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The question isn't what he wants. The question is what you want, and those are 2 completely separate questions that need to be answered separately." I had been so focused on trying to understand Daniel, trying to read his motives, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't, that I had forgotten to ask myself what I actually wanted. What did I want? I want to tell you what I decided, but first I want to tell you something else, something more important than any decision I made about documents or finances or legal arrangements. I decided to have the conversation, not with my attorney, with Daniel. I called him on a Sunday afternoon, his usual time for calling me, which felt right, and when he answered, I didn't start with pleasantries or news or how the grandchildren were doing. I said, "Daniel, I want to talk about something that has been on my mind, and I need you to just listen for a little while before you respond." He said, "Okay." His voice was careful, alert. I told him that I had loved him through 3 years of silence, that I had missed him every single day, that when he called, the relief I felt was real and complete, and I didn't want him to doubt that. And then I told him that the question he had asked about my arrangements had affected me in a way I needed him to understand. I told him that I needed to know, not for legal reasons, not for practical reasons, but for my own heart, whether he had come back because he missed me or because he was thinking about what I represented. I told him that I was not asking to punish him. I was asking because the answer mattered to me more than any arrangement I could make with any attorney. There was a long silence, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. He cried, not immediately, not dramatically, but as he started to talk, haltingly, carefully, the way people talk when they are saying something true that they haven't said before, his voice broke. He said that the 3 years had not been about me. He said that he had been in a period of his life that he was ashamed of, financial difficulties he hadn't told anyone about, a marriage that had come close to ending, a version of himself he didn't want anyone to see. He said that disappearing had felt, at the time, like the only way to protect everyone from what he was going through, including me, especially me. He said that when things had stabilized, when the worst had passed, he hadn't known how to come back, how to explain the absence, how to pick up the phone after 3 years without an explanation. So he had picked it up without one. And the question about my arrangements, he said this quietly, with something that sounded like shame, had come from a real place of fear, his own fear about his own future, not a calculation about mine. I listened to all of it, and when he finished, I sat for a moment with everything he had said. Here is what I have come to believe. Love and fear can exist in the same person at the same time. A child can love their parent genuinely and also be frightened about their own future in ways that distort how they show up. Absence is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is a person drowning quietly and not knowing how to ask for help. And the question, are they here for me or for what I represent? Sometimes doesn't have a clean answer. Sometimes the answer is both, tangled together in ways that even the person themselves cannot fully separate. I don't know the full truth of Daniel's return. I believe what he told me. But I also know that belief and certainty are different things, and I have chosen to live in the space between them rather than demand a resolution I may never fully get. What I know for certain is this. The 3 years of silence were the most honest period of our relationship in a long time, not because silence is better than presence, but because in that silence I learned something about myself that the busyness of our relationship had hidden from me. I learned that I had been performing for my children for decades, performing strength, performing needlessness, performing the role of the mother who is always fine, always managing, always the one who gives rather than the one who needs. I had made myself so self-sufficient, so careful never to be a burden, that I had accidentally communicated something false, that I didn't need them, that my life was full without them, that their presence or absence made no practical difference to me, and people, even people who love you, will sometimes take you at your word. The silence taught me to say what was true, that I missed him, that I needed him in my life not for practical reasons, but because he was my son, and I loved him, and love requires presence to stay alive. That saying that out loud was not weakness. It was the most honest thing I had done in years. I'm 88 years old. Daniel and I speak every week now, not always for long, not always about anything important, but we speak. And there is something different in how we speak, something more careful, more honest, more willing to say the thing that is actually true rather than the thing that is comfortable. I don't know how much time I have. I don't know how much time any of us have, but I know that I would rather spend whatever time remains in honest relationship than in comfortable performance. I would rather say, I missed you, than pretend the silence didn't hurt. I would rather ask the difficult question than live in the relief of not knowing the answer. And I would rather be loved imperfectly, with all the fear and confusion and mixed motives that real people bring, than be loved perfectly by no one at all. If you are sitting somewhere right now with a phone in your hand, wondering whether to call someone you have lost, call. Not because the conversation will be easy. It won't. Not because you will get the answers you want. You might not. But because the silence, however safe it feels, is not where love lives. Love lives in the difficult conversation, in the voice that breaks, in the question that costs something to ask and something to answer, in the willingness to say, I don't know what happened between us, but I know that I love you, and I know that love is worth more than my pride. That is what I learned at 88. Not from a book, not from a wise friend or a thoughtful pastor or a quiet moment of reflection. From a phone call I almost didn't answer. From a son who came back for reasons I still don't fully understand. From 3 years of silence that taught me more about what I needed than 30 years of easy conversation ever had. Pick up the phone. Say the thing. The silence can wait. You cannot.